Hi, Des Bonaventure here. I wanted to do a review of the autobiography of Malcolm X because it's been playing on my mind since I read the book. I do agree with some of it. I think that much of it is really excellent, just as a book and as a memoir, but I strongly disagree with quite a lot of it. And that's very interesting in a book. Usually, if it's a political book, or a memoir, it's either very good or very bad. But in this case, there's a lot going on. So I thought I'd make a review and just present my thoughts about it. So, first of all, very quick review in terms of, is it a good book? Yes, it is. It's an excellent book. The first half of it in particular is brilliant. Okay, there's my review. Now I'm going to share some of my thoughts on it. So, it is an excellent memoir. From the start of the book up to where he goes to prison is just gold. It's as good a memoir as you're likely to read. Maybe there's better memoirs out there. If there is, I can't remember having read them. Maybe I have, but off the top of my head, I can't think of a better memoir that I've read. The time that he describes he was in Harlem, that's just brilliant. That is riveting stuff. It's dramatic, it's fun, it's interesting, it's funny. Some of it's hilarious. There's one scene where he describes going down to the military office because they wanted to draft him for the Second World War. And he puts on this act to make himself look insane. It's really funny. It's brilliant. There's also a lot of historical detail in the book. It's not necessarily deliberate. It's just historical because the book was written a long time ago, and it was written about from his childhood in the 1920s up to the 1960s when he was eventually assassinated. And it's brilliant, especially when he talks about the living in Harlem. He describes a lot of interesting historical details. For example, conking. I had no idea conking was a thing. I'd seen the haircut before, like on Duke Ellington and Little Richard and other rock and roll stars of the day and jazz artists as well. But it never occurred to me that this was that they actually had to put lye in their hair and can't literally chemical burn it to get it to look like that. It's very interesting. He obviously thought that they did it because blacks wanted to look white, but I don't know. I'm not convinced by that. In some cases, yes, but I think at the same time it was just a cool haircut that a lot of people liked having, and it might not necessarily have been done for racial reasons, but probably it was a mix of both. As a confessional, the book is really interesting because he's very honest with his failures as a young man. He describes himself as a degenerate. He describes himself as evil. He says he was called Satan in prison and he deserved to be called Satan. And some of the shit that he did is genuinely evil stuff. It's astonishing that he didn't murder anybody. Like, he was a complete criminal degenerate. And one of the things I really admire about Malcolm X is that he was able to move from being a criminal degenerate to a very well-educated, well-spoken, thoughtful man. That on its own is an amazing achievement, and I admire him for that. The other confessional aspects of it are when he talks about the level of fanaticism that he had as a Nation of Islam follower. Like, he had utter belief in Elijah Muhammad, for example, and he talks about his complete belief in him and how it destroyed him when he eventually lost his faith in him. That's very interesting. That's very confessional because it's a man admitting to his flaws and his mistakes in his life. Those are all great. And the writing is very direct, straightforward, non-pretentious, and great to read. The problems I have with it start with the historiography. His historiography, that is his study of history, his way of thinking about history, is frankly bad. I'll start with, so I've got it broken down into a few categories here. I'll start with blacks. He asserts that blacks had been made meek and weak and kind of pathetic and harmless by Christianity, that they wouldn't rise up and fight back against their white oppressors because of the Christian religion that had been instilled in him, in the Negro slave. But the fact is, and he keeps talking about, turn the other cheek. Christianity tells you to turn the other cheek, and that's what blacks did, and that's why they're still oppressed. But there are many examples in history which show that that was not the case with black slaves. In Haiti, for example, there were slave rebellions which eventually liberated the country completely. Very violent, very bloody slave rebellions. that resulted in the deaths of many whites in that country. And in the United States, like, what do you think the Civil War was? There were hundreds of thousands of black men that joined the Union Army to arm themselves and train themselves with the specific goal in mind of going south and killing white men to free slaves. Like, that is about it, as violent as you can get in response to the oppression of your people. So I don't agree with him that blacks were made meek by Christianity. I think that the historical record easily disproves that. With regard to whites, he constantly refers to the white devil, and he makes broad sweeping statements about how the white devil has kept blacks down. And it's interesting to get that perspective from blacks, because a black who grew up in those circumstances, when America was actually genuinely a racist country and treated as a second-class citizen and so on, he might get that impression. But I mean, the idea that there is such a thing as the white man in America at that time, it wasn't the case. There were many different groups of white ethnicities. So there were white Irish, white Italians. There was, the WASP, Anglo-Saxon Americans, Eastern Europeans, Russians, Jews, all white, but all very, very different. And really the ones that were most responsible for slavery and for oppressing blacks very aggressively would have been the sort of Anglo-Saxon redneck whites. That's a very specific group, would have been responsible for the vast majority of that historically, but he takes the historical crimes of one very specific set of whites, and he applies it very broadly to all whites in society, talking about the white devil. I mean, are you seriously going to tell me that some Irish guy that's working his ass off to feed his family in New York is part of this, the white devil he refers to? So it's an unfair way of looking at history. It's painting with too broad a brush, and it's not looking at the details and the nuance of history with regard to whites. And he also makes a lot of mistakes historically when he talks about slavery. So a figure that he throws out there is whites went into Africa, they enslaved Africans, and 100 million Africans were pulled out of Africa. Now, that's actually true. It's actually more than that. More than 100 million Africans were enslaved. But the vast, vast, vast majority were enslaved in the Muslim slave trade. The countries that are today in the Middle East and North Africa, which back in the day formed the Muslim Caliphate, they enslaved vast numbers of blacks, and they systematically castrated them, which is why you don't have black populations in those countries today. So the numbers of blacks enslaved by those countries was far higher, and the treatment was far worse. But none of this is mentioned because, I don't know, maybe he wasn't aware of it, or he saw in his historical research that 100 million Africans had been enslaved. Therefore, whites had enslaved 100 million Africans. It didn't even occur to him that actually most of these Africans were being enslaved by Arabs and other Africans. So Africans enslaved other Africans, Arabs enslaved them. And in fact, the only whites that ever enslaved Africans were Portuguese, who enslaved them as war booty, at least according to Thomas Sowell. And when whites went to Africa, they didn't enslave Africans. They bought Africans which had already been enslaved by other Africans. But he doesn't mention any of this. He paints a picture of history that suggests that whites are uniquely evil and are unique in committing these crimes, which I think is a very unfair way of looking at history and just frankly incorrect. And another thing that is quite ironic, he constantly praises Muslims in the Middle East when he talks about his Hajj, when he goes to his trip to Mecca. He talks about how wonderful the Muslims are. He's willing to condemn white people for their historical actions of slavery and so forth, but he's willing to completely ignore the vast, vast crimes committed by Arabs in the slave trade, in their own slave trade. It's completely hypocritical. But again, I don't know if he was aware of this or if he was just willing to overlook it because he was a Muslim. His economic ideas are interesting. They're basically quite bad. He says that the black community could develop by maintaining money within their own community, just like the Jews. He says the Jews do this. So if a Jew wants his house painted, he goes to another Jew. If you want your kids educated, you send it to a Jewish school or to a Jewish tutor or whatever. They keep their money within their own society. In fact, that's largely a stereotype that wasn't true. It's not borne out by the historical data when you look at how Jews interacted with the American economy. And what he's describing, this economic idea that if you keep the money of a community within that community, and blacks only go to other blacks for services and goods as much as possible, all you're going to do is limit the quality of services that are available and limit the quality of goods and products that are available. And it's going to result in a lower standard of living, a lower standard of services and products that the Black community can provide, because they simply aren't accessing the highest level of technology and highest quality of goods and services for their own businesses. You're also not establishing contacts with businesses outside of your own community, which is going to help you grow and help you improve your socioeconomic circumstances. So it's an interesting economic theory, and it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think that by keeping the money in the community, you make the community richer. In fact, when you do that, you make the community poorer. If you want to look at a national example of this, look at North Korea. North Korea had this economic and political philosophy called Duce, which kind of means everything, entirety, self-sufficiency. And it didn't work. It just was an absolute disaster, and the country fell into massive poverty after the 90s and in the 90s and not following the 90s. And it doesn't work on a small scale. It doesn't work on a large scale. If you want to improve the socioeconomic condition of a society, you have to encourage them to do business with among themselves, but also to go out into the world and find other people to do business with, bring the best services from outside into the community, bring the best products from outside into the community, and help the people in the community to find out what they're good at, and to then sell that as a service or a product to people in the community and outside the community. But the idea of making money by being insular doesn't work. One area that I thought he was definitely right on is self-improvement on a community scale, but also on an individual scale. He talks about how when he was living in Harlem, a lot of Blacks gambled and they did drugs and drank a lot and had a lot of bad habits. And he is very open and honest about the fact that if Black America wanted to improve, it would have to face its own vices, face the vices of the individual. Another thing that he mentioned was that Blacks spent all their money. They weren't saving money. They were just going out and spending it all, or they were living on credit. And he's seen this a lot. And he said if Black America wanted to improve their socioeconomic condition within America, they would have to stop that. They would have to start living more disciplined lives and to get rid of the vice that was keeping them down. Now, to be clear, he felt that the Black man's main enemy in the United States was the white man. He makes that very clear in the book, but he also has a level of community self-reflection, which is quite admirable and which you don't get today from modern wokeist authors that are releasing anti-white, neo-racist books today. It's never the fault of Blacks or the Black community. It's always the fault of somebody else, of whites, of racist institutions, of the system, or whatever other nebulous claim they make. It's always someone else's fault. It's never the fault of a guy who's spending all his money on drugs, for example. It's all you're always the victim of somebody else. That's modern wokeism, and that was not his philosophy. He felt that the individual should take responsibility for his or her actions, and that also extended to the community, which I agree with him on. He was right. His integration ideas, basically he was anti-integration. He did not want Blacks to integrate into white society because he didn't believe they could. He felt that whites would never accept them, and that Blacks would also not accept other Blacks that integrated into white society, which, to be honest, I mean, his thinking was coming from the 1950s. That was certainly the case in the 1950s. It became considerably less the case as time went on. But even still, I do think there's quite a lot of that around in the United States. And I've heard that kind of attitude myself in conversations with people. It's nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but it is still true to some extent. And he also felt that Blacks should not rely on integration with whites for economic self-improvement. And again, that's true. You can't just go to somebody else's community and expect to somehow magically for your socioeconomic condition to improve as if by osmosis. You're the one who needs to do the work. You need to, as an individual, work hard. And when many individuals in a community do that, the community rises up. So just by taking large numbers of Blacks and forcing them into white areas, that's not going to do anything for them. He was absolutely right about that. You can adopt the ideas and the institutions of the society that you want to emulate, and that will help. Japan did that in the 19th century, and that helped them rise into an empire. South Korea have been doing that for the past 50 years. It's been very beneficial for them. And blacks used to do that and had great success with it until modern politics got in the way. So, for example, Dunbar High School in Washington produced some of the best students in the country, not just some of the best black students, but some of the best students in the country regularly. They had above average IQ test scores. They had above average exam scores nationally in the United States. And this was a school where the vast majority of students were poor black kids, and they did it by emulating the New England educational culture. And then when it became a neighborhood school and they could no longer apply their own standards to which kids they would accept and which they wouldn't, the school just fell to bits, just became another ghetto school. So I would say he's, in some respects, he's right on integration, and in other respects, he's wrong on it. He was too extreme for me, his integration problems. And his ideas about religion, frankly, are crap. So I've already explained that I don't agree that Christianity resulted in a meek black population that was willing to accept oppression. I think the opposite is true. I think that a lot of blacks were inspired by the idea, the Christian and Western idea, that slavery had become an abomination in the United States, and they went and armed themselves to destroy it with the Union Army. So no, I don't agree with him on that. And also he talks a lot about Christianity, about how Christianity was going to fade away and Islam was going to take its place. He does that near the end of the book, and it's such a disordered, disorganized, poorly written and boring part of the book that I honestly didn't finish it. I finished the book probably about 20 minutes early, and I don't apologize for that. It was just crap. He was completely ignoring the serious shortcomings of Islam, and also ignoring the extensive benefits that Christianity has had for the world in terms of pushing Western civilization to a set of moral principles which now form the basis of human rights. There was none of that. There was absolutely none of that. So I would strongly recommend anyone who is interested in the modern political discourse to read the book. I think it would be very helpful for them. But just be aware that in particular, his historiography is quite poor. All right, that's it.